All right,
Straight
perfect.
up, we're gonna be good.
All right, thank you for that, OC. I think now that we're done with the introductions and reminders, let's call the House into order debating on the motion. This House believes that the Philippine LGBTQIA plus movement should support the politicization of queer media in the Philippines. Let's have PM here.
Wait lang. Setting up my device. Oh my god, I can't hear it.
Wala pa rin.
Ano?
Oh, hello. Teka lang. Audible ka ba? Wait. Ayun. Can you clarify if like you're audible?
Hi everyone. I'd like to clarify if I'm audible.
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Let me set my timer real quick. It won't be long. Hi everyone. Name's Shian, pronoun she, her. They call me Niles. Yeah. I'm currently like sick, so my voice may be a little bit hoarse or something. So we'll be accepting POIs. I think you can raise it through voice, but do not badger. So I think that's all for the POI. Maybe fifth, so long as I set things up. Okay. I think I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Being a part of the LGBTQ plus community in a conservative state would mean that I am seen as lesser of a human being because I am different by identity. The way that people perceive me is less of a person who failed to dignify, for example, my parents simply because of my sexuality or gender. What I want to posit here is that the current media in the Philippines exacerbates the difference of my identity and simplify me or reduce me to a certain, for example, type of persona. But before I proceed to my argumentations, I'd like to discuss viewpoints of things. Number one, these LGBTQ plus communities are portrayed in the mainstream media, talking about how the pop media or TV shows are only limited towards a certain extent or radically exaggerated, for example, version of us. We talk about how our representation is a monolithic by, for example, LGBTQ as genders just wanting to be other genders, for example, or tomboys, or for example, gay. What I want to posit here is on second, LGBTQ plus community exist in a certain spectrum, meaning to say that there are mass gay, or mass lesbian, or there are aromantic, split romantic, pansexual, whatever there is that exists, for example, in LGBTQ plus community. But thirdly, on how queer media, within this queer media, the intersectionality is limited because they're only portrayed as certain personas because they are perceived by the radical messaging, for example, of their identity or exaggeration version of us. This is excessive for this or makes it palatable for people who are conservative. I'm talking about how the portrayals that we have by these communities are true. For example, we can only be seen in comedic media's movies, for example, for funny effect. But rather, the message becomes singular here that you are different and that it's something, for example, for people that becomes less, for example, have resistance towards you. This is where I enter the first argumentation. Number one, we want to lessen the level of resistance towards the movement. Let's talk about the Philippines in general. When we talk about Philippines in general or the society or in like media, it is a religious centered country, meaning to say that there's a level of like conservatism that exists, for example, mainly because people are dominantly, for example, conservative or religious in this country. Talking about how laws, for example, are predominantly towards, for example, people who favors the conservative people. But see, there's a level of resistance that stems from the usual conservative norms due to, for example, the environment that people grow up in towards, for example, this society. Which means to say that there's a level of resistance towards accepting, for example, people who are in the movement simply because of, for example, the lack of portrayals or lack of proper, for example, relatability that associates us, for example, with human, for example, like traits, for example. Which means to say that what I want to target here on level of resistance is on how we want to make it easier integration, because when you depoliticization of this, it means to say that you're trying to like strip or lessen, for example, the radical messaging, for example. There's still elements, for example, of our identity that are talked about, but we're going to strip, for example, the radical messages that may seem, for example, as radical towards conservative people. Talking about how it emphasized, for example, radical messages becomes, for example, a resistance between these people, between these people because you are simply different, and that your radical messages can be seen as something as controversy. We want to clarify before and before else that these, for example, like this portrayal will still talk about their identity or gender, like their sexuality, but not necessarily in radically messaging, for example, the government in general, because it also where we're going to enter or penetrate, for example, the conservative society that we are in, which means to say that we want what how do we achieve the easier integration is by being palatable enough with through portrayal of our LGBTQ plus community in less, for example, politicized version, because the portrayal or on our end looks like LGBTQ plus would be fitting the mainstream palatability, talking about how, for example, we're going to share, for example, relatability on the people, which means to say that when you have, for example, or when you're, for example, your stories are main or portrayals of your character as a whole is more, for example, centric on towards how you relate to other people, as, for example, you're also part of the community of the Filipino, the penetration towards the society because, for example, the penetration becomes easier because there's so long as there's resistance through radical messaging of the movement as a whole becomes like, for example, an aggressive resistance between the people. This is where we want to tell you that the relatability of the people to relate towards other people, because they're also people who are capable individual to love, means to say that it shifts the optic from monolithic identity of being, for example, like exaggerated version of, for example, meme vice to, for example, just humans also capable to feel and love and also shared, for example, like the shared the grievances of Filipino people, which means to say that the TV drama shown in PH mainstream medias will be talk about more on how issues are faces equally, as well as, for example, also talking about your like gender and sexuality as a whole. This means to say that this is how the LGBTQ movement can be seen as human, for example, with lots of humanness. So let's go towards, for example, talk about the LGBTQ plus community and their interest as a whole. What we want to say here is that we do not want misrepresentation, but I want to posit here is on how, for example, representation can be, for example, better fixed on our world if there's lesser of people resisting, for example, this movement. So when we say that when we talk about LGBTQ plus, here's where we tell you that we want progress as a whole. The progress that what we want to paint to you is on how, for example, the palatability through easier integration and more people relating to you leads to, for example, mobilization, because people now see that there's shared realities between factions of people, which means to say that this better, for example, integrates the levels of acceptance or lessen, for example, or at least mitigate, because we cannot necessarily entirely eradicate, for example, conservative people. But what we want to posit here is where can we at least gradually penetrate towards the system that actually, for example, resist us. This means to say that lobbying policies or mobilization of grassroots people, or, for example, catering to like this LGBTQ plus community will be better, because at least the government will not, for example, resist you as somewhat of an organization that is just radical. Here's where we tell you that even in the worst case scenario where the radical messaging for example, where we get misrepresented, the prerequisite, for example, correcting those is the moment that the government or the society actually recognize us. Here's where we tell you that even if the messaging, for example, is even if, for example, it's far more like better or urgent in opposition side, what we want to question here is on what, for example, or a certain extent or levels of internalization of the society to perceive, for example, LGBTQ plus community as a pressing issue, considering, for example, that the media, for example, like portray us as one, for example, like certain monolithic being. But here's where we tell you why, for example, the media is of important role. The media plays an important role, particularly in the mainstream, because it teaches what, for example, the society sees or how the environment is shaped towards what is, for example, shown. This is where we tell you that it's far more better for LGBTQ community to be depoliticized the queer media in the Philippines.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have leader of peer here.
Okay, hi. Hey. So, hold on. So since it's grand, I wanted to do like really some shout outs, like really quickly. So first shout out to my parents, to my Tinang who hears all of my debate rants, to Enigo, Chris, and Pollux who are watching the round. Um, to my teammates, especially towards James, because this is I think her last high school tournament. So thank you for letting us send you off to the real world. I'm just kidding. And then last, because that's been my fire lately. Okay. Just give me a few moments. Yeah, James entering on stuff. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Respectability politics will never get us anywhere or never cause any change. On the government side of the house, change does not happen or at least remain stagnant when you latch onto media that is inherently palatable to the general public, when you allow yourself to not cause change or you allow yourself to be you allow yourself to be safe so that you're able to get an amount of respectability or at least an amount of representation. What I'm going to do is firstly rebuttals, secondly frame, and thirdly arguments, and fourthly impacts. First then on rebuttals, government says that in our side of the house we reduce these people to a persona, or we reduce queer people to a specific persona that is like comedic or radically exaggerated. I think the reason for this is why it's so important to be political, because political media political queer media will highlight the struggles that they face, and these are the struggles that I don't think the Filipino people are able to truly understand when you perceive media when media is made palatable when it's made palatable for mainstream media. I think then, because of that, you are not able to let Filipino people understand the lived experiences of queer people, or to understand what they're going through, or at least what in their life they've experienced, and you reduce them down to a caricature that does not represent who they truly are and misrepresents them instead. That is why that is why it's so important to oppose depoliticization. Second then, they say that being palatable is what's going to cause change. I think that generally the palatability already exists within the Philippines, that I'm going to explain more later in my argument. Later. Second then, they explain to us that most likely the media nowadays is radically exaggerated, which is why the Filipino people is most likely to not understand the lived experience of queer people. I think this is not necessarily true, because if you look at LGBTQ plus media within the Philippines, or queer media within the Philippines, you'll notice that it's most likely comedic, where they don't really talk about the issues that queer people or the hardships that queer people go through. So that means that most likely you as a Filipino don't take them seriously. You don't understand what they go through. You don't understand everything that they've had to face, because you reduce them down to stereotypes that you see within within media, right? That means that within a gov side of the house, any type of progressive portrayal gets seen as horrible, because you are reduced to a caricature and you can never get better. You never get real change on government side of the house. First, okay, now on to setup, right? I want to clarify that the movement in itself, or the LGBTQ plus movement in itself, is inherently political in the first place. The reason why I explain that is because for queer people to fight for the rights that they need to challenge the system. They need to fight for what they believe in, and they need to be able to pass these laws so that they can be more safer, and for people to understand what they go through more. I think then that when you encourage the depoliticization of this media, you regress the movement in itself. What then do we think the political messaging looks like? I think this just looks like the experiences of these people, because then again, the experiences that queer people go through is inherently political, through the hardships and stuff like that. And I feel like the political messaging then, the goal of political messaging is to give visual support to these queer people, so that they are not portrayed like one-dimensional, and they are not portrayed in the ways and the stereotypes that the Filipino people already see them as. What then do we think queer media looks like within within the Philippines. I think that it exists within specific stereotypes. In the media, in the mainstream media, you are portrayed, the queer people are most likely portrayed as happy with no struggles, and that there's like this general stereotype going around. So for example, vice ganda, for example, Mimia, you don't really see them as somebody who struggles. You see them as somebody who is happy and is not going through anything difficult. What then do we have exclusively on upside of the house? In upside of the house, we are able to keep both mainstream media and political media, because we are able to push these struggles and stories of queer people while also keeping mainstream media. Up has to totally depoliticize media, and they don't have the exclusive advantage that we have. I think then that most likely, because of these stereotypes, they don't understand that queer people don't struggle, and therefore don't understand why they have to rally, why do they have to protest, right? Especially because Gov does mention this, that the Philippines is Catholic, which means most likely I think there is a sense of palatability already within media, but people are just more tolerant and towards these queer people, and they enjoy having them as friends or at least as company, but they don't understand the lived experiences of queer people, so they don't understand why bills have to be passed, and they don't understand why they don't necessarily accept these people, and they only tolerate them. What then do we think the movement's incentives is? I think the movement's incentive is to get their bills passed, or at least for them to for bills to be passed for their safety and for their for their for the movement, and also because we want them to I think the movement's incentive is also help understand queer experiences, especially because it's usually that they're created as more palatable, like government mentions with mainstream media. So the goal of the movement then is for not for people to see them, not just for people to see how they live, but to see how their struggles are as a person and all of the things that they have to face inherently. Before I go on, what's your POI?
So I just have to question, how do movements push for politically?
I think then that movements are able to push forward politically when we explain that movements are able to push forward politically when people are able to understand the lived experiences of queer people, and they're able to understand why we need to fight for rights in the first place, or why these queer people are actively pushing forward politically. Because on government side of the house, what happens to you is that you generalize queer people, and then what happens is that you think that you put them in like specific boxes, and then what happens is that you don't get any change. It remains stagnant, so you are not able to push. First argument then, I think that most likely individuals within, I think the reason why opposition wins this debate is because we are able to prioritize the individuals and the queer individuals within the community. I think that most likely in status quo, especially within the context of the Philippines, they don't feel understood and they don't feel seen. This is not limited to the fact that the Philippines is a conservative country, but because of the way that queer people are portrayed in media, I believe most likely Filipino individuals stereotype queer people and put them into specific shoe boxes, so they don't understand, and they don't understand like the vast majority of the experiences of queer individuals. Because of that, they are most likely not going to fight for queer people's experiences, and most likely they won't understand, or they won't even try to understand, because of the way that they already currently perceive this. What happens then? You are able to have individuals who are not happy, or at least who don't feel seen, who don't feel understood. Secondly, what happens is that you have things like legal complications, right? They don't understand why these queer people fight, or at least why they fight and why they protest, or why they inherently have to fight for their beliefs, or at least fight for the inequality that they face, and that they aren't able to help them or at least assist them, and there's no push. I want to then explain that there's urgency in this, in that the reason why it's so important that it's urgent is so we can push for more change, and so that the movement won't remain stagnant especially in the Philippines. Proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have deputy time. Here.
Hello, give me a few seconds. Okay, I just turned on the light. Okay, honey. Few shout outs. First to Cupcake Factory, second to HDS, third to my own Insti, Instimates pala. Yes, Ysabel yan, or I'm not sure if Stacy's observing, pero hopefully she is. Then, I guess last shout out to my teammates. Firstly to, wait lang, I'm so sorry, I forgot their names. Joke. Firstly to Niles, thanks very much for being such a queen behavior and like so preppy, although I kept panicking 24/7. And then also, ideally shout out, thanks to Chat as well. If Nails is the queen behavior, I think like Chat is the king behavior. So if Nails is the queen and Chat is the king, what am I? I am the deputy prime minister in these finals. Okay. Pronouns, anything, POIs. I will ask. Oo. Shout out to Hale, to one of the best people in the entire world. Also, actually, shout out to yes, let's go Queens. We're more than fulfilled proceeding to grands. Because we already slept after the results, sorry. Okay, so if I medyo pagaw, that's because I just woke up. Yes, I will start with the next word, and as mentioned earlier, I will ask you guys for POIs, don't worry. Since round 1, I have been asking. I'll just be placing it here so I can clearly see. If you want to raise POI either ways, just raise it via chat, type POI. But even if you won't be typing anything in the chat, I will still ask regardless. Time and time again, mainstream media has failed to properly portray queer people. All we see are active portrayals, how they are nothing but rebels of the Philippines, or how their actions are always are always from Eastern values, such as, and is oftentimes not. And is not from Eastern values such as communal values or familial values. We trust the media to show us, but we do not trust them to interpret us. Let's clarify the proper margin. Queer media likely exists on both ends. Queer agenda likely will not shift away from their political incentives. The depoliticization only deals as to which institution or movement is legitimate in interpreting them. I first extend, therefore, that the depoliticization is a political act to acknowledge that queer media representation has always been imperfectly harmful towards the movement itself. Four things that I want to argue under this. Firstly, lessening the amounts of political portrayals allow the queer movement to streamline the political optics back to the queer movement. This means that people are less likely going to rely on common queer shows to jump into these surface level conclusions about queer individuals, but rather this allows the queer movement to properly reclaim as to which form of queer identity is actually truly represents them. But secondly, this form of action, albeit a call-out mechanism of the system, is a peaceful action that strengthens the further relationship between media and queer movements. This is intuitively true because honestly, no media industry wants to engage in political industries because they've always been wanting to avoid political instability and further repercussions. This looks like being averse to creating films that are political, but rather it is much more familial and bears elements that inherently create huge stimulants for people to view. This looks like your average romance films, MLM, or like WLW or what have you. But thirdly, the margin enters on the amount of opt-in for people to view it. We'd bite and prefer a world where at worst people have less avenues to watch it as long as you remain the accuracy within these portrayals. But this is why the support should come from the queer movement because of two sub-reasons. One, this form of support creates a massive visibility or support when it directly comes from them. This is because the movement becomes temporarily tied towards media outlets themselves that ensures transfer of knowledge or opt-in. But B, the act of supporting allows an active reclamation for the queer movement to do so without needing to do things from scratch. So this means that on the last layer, even if I assume that it creates conflicts of interest within the industry itself, we think that it's fine because of three key sub-reasons. One, PM already discussed why mainstream media is not suitable for discussing sensitive topics, but aside from general viewer discretion, they also have to abide to massive rules, e.g. regulations from MTRCB that forcibly waters down the efficacy of these political acts. The problem is, even if the media itself is watered down, the general viewer discretion still thinks that is the fullest extent of manifestation about their political upbringings. This means that two, the massive harms enter because it disproportionately causes a shift of perception and a false sense of wisdom to the general people. That's where people become much more trapped in consuming surface level information under the assumption that they already do know everything or the vast majority about queer movements. This means that the active political reinterpretation does not only come from the media, but now it almost comes from almost every average consumer that exists. Intuitively, by population density, the amount of people talking about it like straight people directly blocks the capacity for the queer movement or queer individuals to dominate these political spaces. But two, this means that they're dispossessed from reclaiming and re-entering these very avenues that should have been theirs to begin with. But even if they can communicate actively, the queer movement find it harder to regulate these spaces because of their limited capacity, and as a byproduct of Op's best case about disproportionately democratizing this to the people because the influence happens too fast. What is the clearest conclusion under this? One, no, this is not about fully depoliticizing queerness. This is re-centralizing what avenues should depoliticization ought to happen. What side government proves is the fact that it should come inherently from these movements, so at least information is directed much more accurately towards the queer movement and prevent them from the dispossession in interpreting queerness itself. But two, on positioning, if this is indeed about protecting queer people and properly representing them, it is on giving them their rights back to dominate these spaces, not irrationally expanding your political message when you surely know you cannot sustain it to begin with. Before proceeding, point. No POI. I'll expand further based on two prongs. Firstly, on social acceptance, but secondly, about increasing representation. I want to note that OP is highly assumptive that portrayal automatically means that the credits to those efforts automatically ties back towards the queer movement itself. In fact, oftentimes it is not. The reason why mainstream queer stereotypes that PM mentioned literally is the dominating form of queer interpretation is because the queer movement is barely credited about this. How do we change that on-side government? One, you directly shift yourself alongside the demands of the people, that since either ways there would be an information asymmetry and preferences, that it's much better to lessen the amounts of topics in queer media and rather redirect the much more sensitive topics towards the queer movement itself. Intuitively, this tells the viewers optically that they listen to the people's demands and are much more open, therefore you are able to pervade these spaces much more internally. But also because this prevents premature acceptance and messaging from happening inside government, because you have to sustain less discussions within mainstream media. The counterfactual then on government further looks like having more time to engage on political discussions outside the outlet where they have more control, e.g. being away from the regulatory measures that exist on mainstream media, which means that you actually engage towards respectability politics more on opposition because you subsume them towards mainstream media. On-side government, you liberate them. But also because there's where they permeate these spaces much easier. Even mainstream media is connected politically, but also because realistically speaking, change cannot happen through an external approach, so all forms of their call-out mechanisms, etc., instead of an internal approach is less effective in this round. But also because since it's too resource exhaustive to maintain mainstream media optics whose topics are inherently controversial on government, then you allow further pushing for different political actions that allows them to pervade these spaces more efficiently and in a much more diversified manner. What proves the exclusivity of this impact? One, maintaining media optics is very hard, especially if you're talking about sensitive topics, because it's highly controversial in nature, but also because your targeted audience is highly unnuanced, that any other random individual who openly disrespects queer is given a platform to react to it. On-side government, you allow information dissemination to pass through the people who are firstly centuries at most and slowly change to get greater capacity that compiles over time. But two, this is why this discussion from PM about ensuring multifaceted discussion is important, because this also means that they are much more seen in a much more accurate manner. The problem is that LO mistakenly clashes this as value neutral when there's a clear difference about the avenues that they occupy to begin with. This is the massive tieback and positioning coming from side government. I think that one, messaging and social acceptance is much more genuine on side government when you allow it to happen in a proportionate scale at which you are able to sustain, instead of sharing it towards every people regardless of their status and regardless of the flexibility to follow your narrative. This means that it's less likely for other malevolent actors to enter the very sensitive spaces that you do want to protect and you do want to prevent them from reclaiming it away from you. But two, because representation do exist on our world much more sustainably. Maybe at worst, it's going to be slower, but it's much more sustainable and avoids the active reinterpretation and backsliding towards queer individuals. All of those reasons, government.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have the LO here.
Okay. My name is Allane, delinquent, from Japan. Okay, a few shout outs. Number one, shout out to my family. Thank you for their love and support in this expensive and tiring and grueling sport. Secondly, shout out to my teammates for this tournament, James and Ioli. I have really enjoyed our time together. Every round was really funny. I found something to laugh about every time. Yes, we all like coffee jelly. Then lastly, to my institution mates, specifically Chris, Inigo. Okay, well, Inigo. But let me just mention my friends. Inigo, Pollux, Chris, Iole, Jaden, everyone else. And our seniors, specifically Kim and Sophia, for mentoring us, even when we were stubborn and took so long to improve. We thank you for all your support. Okay. POI's voice. I will take them if I have time, or just like whenever I call. Starting my speech. 3, 2, 1, go. Rebuttal, I want to move to the government case, is on their point that we are able to co-opt the queer movement in such a conservative society, and so we're able to bridge the gap between what is acceptable and making the queer movement necessarily more co-opted within the Philippine society. Firstly, I think inherently this is a problematic method already of trying to shift the responsibility from holding homophobia and a conservative society accountable to making the queer movement inherently tolerable. So what this means then is instead of necessarily critiquing politically the problems of our conservative society and the problems of homophobic people, what you do is instead make yourself as a movement or as a queer individual more likable and tolerable, and that just ties into their whole respectability politics case that they ran from second to first. I think also second rebuttal then is on their point of the reclamation of queer identity, and I think this is their most important point so far. So we're going to be quite charitable. I think firstly, this already directly contradicts the frame of their prime minister, because number one, prime minister told you that you're necessarily just reframing the queer movement to be less radical when the movement is inherently radical. So we don't necessarily understand how you're able to reclaim queer identity when in the first place, if you depoliticize the movement in media, you cannot encapsulate the whole radical point of the movement in the first place. So you lose out on things like intersectionality, you lose out on complex issues that will not be discussed if you depoliticize the media. But I think secondly, this just concedes already to the lack of complex representation that occurs in status quo, which is why Ioli's speech was so important. Because if individuals or people are not able to understand individuals and how queer individuals and the queer movement and what the struggles they go through are, the very fact is people will not feel the necessity of fighting for them, of fighting for the movement and pushing it forward to a more progressive place in society. The argument then I want to bring in this debate is explaining to you the fragmentation of the queer movement and queer identities in general. Because notice what this argument explains is that you're removing the inherent politics of the movement, and so you detach the movement from its true purpose, from its true goal in the first place. There are three layers and three ways this argument functions. Firstly, on fragmentation and exclusion. We explained to you that chasing palatability ultimately means you chase respectability politics and you are unable to necessarily unite the movement, and you exclude specific actors such as trans people or trans people in general or other people who fall within the binds of intersectionality. What this explains is that when you exclude intersectional realities of the movement, so you get things like for example, trans exclusionary sentiment, that only happens when you strip the presence of politics. Because what government does is that they make complicated politics something simple, something digestible for the media to consume, something for them to tolerate, by framing politicization as something that's inherently radical for some reason. The second mechanism under this argument is to explain the greater inequality that occurs overall. Because notice that this narrative that we push out inherently focuses on the legal and social experiences of queer people and what the queer movement goes through in general in the fight for greater equality and in the fight for greater acceptance within such a conservative society. Later, we explained to you that social experiences for queer individuals worsen inherently because of the power of media. Because what we explained to you is that the following generations who consume this depoliticized media and simply see gay people as just like, oh my God, gay people, learn to perceive queer identity as a lesser societal concern because they're not pushed the idea that maybe the queer movement does have issues and does have something they need to fight for. So the very fact is you separate the necessity of the movement's goal, and then you necessarily just focus on the people that exist and the fact that they're gay, nothing else from that. This trickles down to younger generations in the future with something such as simple as how you see your friends. So for example, that might look like just merely tolerating your friends versus having full acceptance of them, because you don't necessarily understand the complexity of their queer identity, and you don't have what it takes to necessarily accept them because you don't understand the full complexity of it. You don't give them the capacity to be able to accept these people because you don't give them the understanding of what it means to be able to accept someone as a queer individual. Before I go,
I'm not sure if DLO muted Sidekov, but until DLO, they still never engaged that the nuance in the round is in selecting which platform should the politicization happen, not on fully removing it on side government.
Okay, so even if it is the case that you only use a select form of media to be able to depoliticize this, I think number one, you still miss out on the very fact that you're doing that in the first place inherently regresses the movement's goal, inherently regresses the movement's progression, insofar as you choose to commit to something that contradicts with the movement's goal in the first place. So even if you choose only a select form of media for the movement, we think you inherently still regress the movement in general. The last mechanism of this argument is to explain the societal shift to respectability politics, and notice how this will engage with the other side's cases. Notice then that depoliticization requires the catering of the narrative towards the status quo of media toleration. Because notice, if it is true on government's side, if it is true on both sides that the Philippines is a conservative society and we exist in a very religious society, then it means that what you inherently do is you create a narrative that caters towards status quo in a way that creates only merely tolerance, right? So what that means is two things. Firstly, the movement inherently becomes reliant on media acceptance in order to co-opt the movement, instead of what I explained earlier, holding people accountable for their homophobia or holding society accountable for their homophobia. But I think also secondly, political messaging's strong absence makes it so that absence becomes the status quo. So that means in the long term, it is harder to introduce political messaging back, even if we buy government that they'll still have some kind of political messaging in the first place. So even if government cares about these queer people, they inherently kill them later on. For all these reasons, vote opposition.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have Government Web here.
Hello. Oh, I cannot turn on my cam because anyways, nice one. Wait, what is this? Okay. Anyways, hi, my name is Chat. The pronouns he him. POIs preferably. Where is chat? Cannot see it. Okay, POIs preferably through chat. But I'm so sorry. I don't think I can. Can you please? Sorry. I don't think I can take in POIs because I unfortunately wrote too much. But anyways, before anything, let me please go to my shoutouts because it's not every day that I reach grants. So I'd like to give like a few shoutouts because it's not because I'm egotistical, but more like because I owe it to them. But also like this is one of my very few grants appearances, so best seize the moment like to LARP the actual goats, to LARP like the actual goats in debate. So first and foremost, to Ate Hale, as she says, she's our benefactor. She's the main reason I or we even got the debate here at Cebu Schools because she benevolently, wow, shut up. Okay, offered us like a wave team slot. Like thank you so much for that, Ate. Then second to my teammates, of course, for accepting my invites, Stewie and Nils. I don't know why I became the king, and I don't know why Nils became the queen. But anyways, hell yeah, I'm also the government whip. It's been an incredibly fun ride, especially that I got to come back to my favorite debate format, which with debate, which is like AP, obviously, and with incredibly like goated and reliable teammates like you guys. So this wouldn't have been as fulfilling had it not been with you guys. So di man ako maka-Nash DC, at least pre-Nash pa rin kahit papaano. Third, again, to Phil. I'll never forget to thank Phil, or more legitimately known as the Harvest Debate Union, or by extension, Kamalig Debates, because this is the support system that never fails to encourage me to keep doing more despite the uncertainties and offsets that I often experience with debate. To Kuya Jack, ang tatay ng lahat, he's the main reason how we got to form a community in debate that's central to support and outreach or meaningful causes, and so much more. Hopefully, we get to be legitimized soon, or whatever you'd call it, to make debate much more accessible and palatable towards the general public, which is like our main goal as of now. To the members of HDU, we have Sean, Ethan, Claudia, Jillian, congrats with your PNC run. Kuya Jason na hindi na makabalik sa debate dahil sa NSTP niya during weekends. So we miss you, Kuya. To Kuna, Komish on CSAP as well. To Kuya Carl, Star, JM, Kuya George, Helois, Aki, and to the rest of the entire HDU. Here's to more milestones with you guys. Hopefully we get to reach for more. And of course, lastly to Kuya Amil, thank you for helping us find a space for us to debate safely with a stable internet because my there's a poor interruption. Okay, that was a very long shout out. I'm so sorry. Anyways, again, I'm so sorry. I don't think, like, to be for real, I don't think I can take any of you guys. Starting in three, two, one. When you let the blood-sucking and money-driven corporate media to try and get hold of the identity of LGBTQ plus community and their lived realities, what often happens is that they continuously misinterpret where their identity comes from, and often they only portray them as radical individuals that are continuously so loud within the streets, clamoring for like more queer public spaces, for example, rallying endlessly and an overly problematic group of people. That it often just generates a lot of traction for the sole idea that it generates clout because of its controversial against the Philippines, for example. Systemic oppression often sidetracks the actual reasons as to why these queer individuals are clamoring for gender equality in the first place. That they never had the support systems within their own social constructs, and they never knew what it was like to be free, like the hetero people that exist in the get-go. To be clear, we understand that this type of messaging isn't by the fault of the queer communities. We're not skewing the responsibility towards them. Don't believe opposition. That we only push that their clamors are valid and and come from legitimized socially oppressive systems that hinder them from being able to fully express their identity and their struggles. What we explain is that because they already have so much backlash currently within the Philippines, for example, and face a lot of active resistance against the conservative populace in the Philippines because of how media politicizes their portrayal for clicks and revenue, it gets far harder to break the barrier of entry to get to reintegrate them within society and be seen as equals as one that looks like an ordinary Filipino people that struggles socioeconomically, for example. But it also further risks the dilution of the identity of the queer individuals precisely because you can never trust corporate media to outlets to be capacitated to nuance the spectrum that exists. Like the explanation from Naila was very clear. What this repositioning does is clear and simple. It clarifies that one, corporate media only sees the queer community as a milking cow for the reasons that they garner huge levels of traction, for example, to a point where they're far unlikely to be capacitated or even incentivized to nuance the lived realities of these individuals. That the messaging almost always gets skewed to just quote unquote the radical versions of these queer people, which again is the root of resistance by the conservative communities in the get-go. Hence, stigma will still proliferate at the end of the day and gets harder and harder to dismantle as time passes by. And I'm going to extend that later on and make it much more clear on the margin. But second, it's far easier to have people see you as an equal, especially the conservative community, when you are portrayed as less likely to be radically exaggerated. This is the mainstream media that we're talking about, but more likely an ordinary person, for example, that struggles with the same breadth of issues as that of an ordinary Filipino goes through. e.g. like through their economic status, having less job opportunities, being part of the poor, having less access to proper healthcare education and whatnot. Think like I forgot the show, like the exact name, like of Vice Ganda, where their life was more central towards their family and less on voicing out to have more clear bathrooms, for example. It was more on how they get to survive on a daily basis with their peria or their like carnival, for example. This in turn clearly paints the same breadth of ordinary Filipino struggles that they have to make ends meet on a daily basis. And third, by extent, lowering the resistance is thereby far more attainable within side government and much more clearly, because you are now seen as an equal by a vast majority of conservative individuals. They now find an intersectionality with you with what DLO is looking for, because your lived realities as a queer individual is now seen as something that's not alien. For example, you're more likely to be accepted, and if not, at least they do not actively shame you right now, contrary to status quo. Where on opposition, these conservative people will continuously misinterpret the messaging that they portray, despite us assuming full benevolence over the corporate incentives of just generating traction. For example, this is what LO explains, that they want to force themselves to the people who see them as aliens in a get-go. At most, you only evoke public backlash more to these film institutions, but also the queer community as at large, for example, which is out of their control. Taking religion, for example, if to have people truly subscribe, you need to leave them to rationalize their decision and exercise their autonomy without having to feel coerced, and that they do not need to feel forced and understanding someone, because their fundamental cognitive thinking is something that has a far disparity in the very first place. All these frames are still standing that are left sufficiently responded to from LO and DLO. This means that if you weigh these models clearly, it's far more proximate to the queer community in the get-go. Let's weigh things, and this is where I engage more robustly. First, where do we actually give safety nets to these individuals? First, the problem that they launched at LO is that the mainstream media is often typecasting or are stereotypical in nature. For example, that Vice Ganda gets portrayed as a happy-go-lucky Santong Caballo. This is not true. Oftentimes, mainstream media portray these queer people as those who are struggling socioeconomically. This does not only mean that they are poor, but sometimes how their own family struggles to accept them and whatnot. This is something that's far more resonant towards the average individual, where family ties are often the problem, and that the idea of being a comedic relief is a clear portrayal of them coping within times of stress. These are the mundane things that the average individuals find it more easier to relate and get to resonate with, for example, because they're not something that's incredibly political, which is something that if people are inherently risk averse or like averse of in the very first place, such as what Stewie explains very clearly. But P, even if you do not believe me that they are stereotyped and this is us biting the worst case, but I flip this. I don't understand how you're far better going to have better messaging on their side and representation within opposition bench, because at large it only looks like you're riding the stereotype of being quote unquote radical, for example, which the general society has branded on you. This response kills their case on the entire op bench. We're more likely than not on their comparative. You're more likely to cause fragmentation within your own community, because they never explain why the corporate medias are going to be incentivized to do research and nuance the LGBT portrayal on their side. This means that the movement will likely lose its structure, because oftentimes the spectrum does not fully feel represented for the exact reasons that we explained from Niles to Stewie. This is us winning on the metric of providing safety net towards the queer people. They're far more likely to equally portray these individuals on the median scale on our side. For example, on something that's far easier to agree on their side, you far create reasons for this movement to collapse, because there's no clear and unifying direction for change, for example, because again, the spectrum needs different levels of certain political leverages. For example, it's a clear flip from DLO. On our side, you're far better to ensure that these communities get to feel the gradual lowering of resistance from the centrists at best and the conservatives at the absolute best case of government. This looks like how you're far better able to push for discussions that understand that gay people are more than just gay and happy people, that you pique the interest of the audience because they are curious and they got to understand, they got to realize that, they're not aliens, they suffer the same shit that we're going through. This is a key to understanding that TLO is looking for, because you lower the barrier of understanding, for example, to see eye to eye within these individuals. The second weighing metric I want to weigh on is exactly how do we ensure that movements get to sustain in the long run, especially with the current existing support systems that NGOs are for example, NGOs that are pro-gender minorities. First, what we explained from Stewie is simple, that oftentimes political reparations or political integration is incredibly resource exhaustive, not only financially but extends towards time and even structural and systemic support. This is the precise reason why we do not still have the SOGSC bill successfully passed within status quo. For example, we explain that it's a clear problem solution mismatch because you never reach to the threshold of understanding in the very get-go. The older seasons, the type of externality or like the type of method of politically leveraging yourself as a queer community should not come from media itself. Older seasons clearly go.
Thank you for that speech. Let's have opposition appear here.
Before we start, can we kick out one person if that's allowed so I can like turn on camera? Is that possible? Or that's not allowed at all? Yeah. Okay. While we're contending with that, I'm gonna just give my shout out first. First, shout out to my friends. Shout out to Sab, especially Sab. Our height difference is crazy. If you know, you know. See you in Adno. Shout out to my friends because I wouldn't be anything without them. Shout out to my kids, to Pollux who's going off to DLSU. Bye bye. And shout out to Inigo who's going off to Admo and we'll still see regularly. So hello. And shout out to Chloe and Iole. I'm so proud of them. I honestly could not think of a better future for the HBDP without them. Same with you, Ciara, everyone else who's also in the HBDP. I cannot imagine the future of the HBDP without you. I'm more proud of anything. If there's anything I'm proud of, it's you guys. By extension, and speaking of pride, I want to say thank you overall to the circuit because this is my last schools tournament. Not last tournament before I go to college because I have the audacity to take a tournament right before ORSEM. But yeah, thank you so much for being my last high school tournament. Oh, okay. Camera's on. Whatever. Thank you so much for being my last schools tournament. I think I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that no one exists without prerequisite context from which they are derived. And you guys are the context from which I am derived. I cannot exist without you. We cannot exist without each other. I hope the speech is my love letter to the circuit and to the community because I'm so grateful that I get to be part of this community. Thank you so much to whoever I've debated against, whoever I've seen in debate for being my context. Thank you so much. Yeah. There is no greater violence than the violence of invisibility, for invisibility is the prerequisite to dehumanization, and dehumanization the basis of all inequality. I want to immediately talk about what government tries to explain within the context of their speech because it's quite confusing going forward. The way that they talk about it operates in two specific ways. That one, on Stewie's end, that they say that they concede the amount of control they have on media in order to refocus it around more palatable parts of queer fragmentation. But two, on their side of the house, they are probably significantly more okay with being perceived as less political because of the fact that it allows them to be perceived just in general within the Filipino community. I want to immediately focus this back as to what status quo for queer media already looks like. Immediately, the first point already is shown at Iole, that the way that the queer community is perceived in the Philippines is already to a certain extent tolerant because of the fact that we have people like Bianca, we have people like Mimia. We see people in status quo and to a certain level, see them and say, oh, gay people, and we are not necessarily outright homophobic towards it, which is why there is a direct and distinct urgency for the fact to show the real political side of how people in queer media feel. Because notice then how this motion is explained, that this requires a complete sanitation of that media, that you require complete erasure of the political harm that people live. And unfortunately, within the context of this community, within the context of the Philippines, my very existence is political. The fact that I had to break up with my girlfriend because I did not know if I would get into ADMU, if I even passed the exam, was because of the fact my parents would allow me, is political. The fact that constantly people in the Philippines have to risk their lives with AIDS and STDs because the fact there is no actual proper sex ed or protection for them in the first place is a fact of erasure because of the fact they do not see that in media, because the fact that they do not see themselves represented within these people and they are incapable of knowing these things in the first place. So the direct harm is already obvious coming from Iole. When you do not see yourself, you do not see the harms that come with being yourself in the first place. But secondly, and this is most imperative, when they say that they're going to concede their oppression in social media or like just in media in general so that they are capable of doing things such as lobbying for other stuff that they have more power over, I want to say that immediately this is wrong because intuitively all movements, whether social or just literally any other kind, require media as the power point of how they are capable of launching themselves forward. Because absent media, you are never going to be able to change the perception of how people see you in a larger scale. Because This is imperative because absent that, you are incapable of reaching the same systemic change that they're capable of doing. Yola and Chloe already mentions this, that the prerequisite to systemic change is to have systemic knowledge of how these people are perceived. Because when you people like Vice Ganda, when you see people like Mimia on your screen, your first thought that you have is not necessarily, I think that they suffer, but rather particularly to dehumanize them and see them on a pedestal, that this is what a queer person looks like, that this is what a gay person looks like, and ultimately you struggle to find any sort of harm upon these people. It's the same reason why in status quo, things like the Soggy Bill constantly go through denials and do not manage to pass, because the fact that people already perceive queer people as having enough rights and do not see the shared collective struggle. This is an intuitive point, because immediately I'm going to take them at their best, because on their best case scenario, maybe people do see who they are, but they do not see the actual tenets of how they exist and the suffering that comes with being queer in the first place. In the absence of that suffering, you are incapable of making sure that any progress goes ahead. But go ahead, POI. 3, 2. Yeah.
Circumstance.
You cut off. But regardless of that, I think regardless of what circumstance people are in, I think that ultimately what is necessary is that people are capable of making systemic change, because that cannot happen on government side of the house. You already say it yourself. You concede the larger power of your media in order to make sure that you are necessarily at least presented in some way. Notice how the ultimate case there is that, on their side of the house, we are ultimately going to be portrayed somewhat in with caricatures. We're going to be portrayed in a way that is not necessarily as palatable to the public. But the issue here then is, if you give up your power over the media, if you give up and you agree to depoliticize literally everything you are perceived upon in status quo, that caricaturization not only exists, but it gets significantly worse because you yourself have no power over it. You as the movement do not try to lobby for better laws that allow you to protect it. You do not have the capacity to go to the Philippine film administrations and do things such as, hey, let's not make queer movies 16 plus automatically just for being queer. You lose the ability to lobby for things like that because you concede that you don't have power over it. You concede your political prowess over it. And that means you ultimately just don't have the capacity to work that out. Secondly, it means that when you do all of these things, you have significantly less opt-in. Because notice how the case of opt-in is largely confusing on their side of the house. It is simply that by seeing more palatable in status quo, you are likely to want to align with the queer movement. But intuitively, this also doesn't work because right from the start, most people in the Philippines are not outright homophobic, but rather tolerant in the extent that they are only okay with queer people as long as they fit within the perception that they already see in status quo. Whether that be through the fact that like certain queer celebrities are only portrayed as this or only portrayed as that, which is why you need to show the systemic harms that come with being queer in the first place and the systemic disenfranchisement in which they are seen. Because to be invisible means that you are incapable of fighting for things like legislation and lobbying. Chloe mentions this also in their speech more explicitly in two specific ways, that on their side of the house, they're probably significantly more likely to have things like representation, but if not representation, they are more likely to have things such as protections because of the fact that you constantly see these people, and in simultaneously, not just protections because you see these people, but because of the fact that you view them as imperative and people who go through unnecessary harm. Because when you do not see that harm, you erase identity. And when you erase identity, you do not as a whole humanize these people and understand them for what they are and understand that they need protections and rights. This extends towards a larger extent because notice how the concept of seen as evil is mentioned at WIP, but you do not get seen as evil if you're constantly being shown that these people suffer and are marginalized and constantly exist in a context in which they have to be protected. Government's case tries to dance around this by saying that on their side of the house, maybe it's going to be depoliticized, maybe this thing still gets shown, but ultimately it has no coherent string across speaker to speaker, and that means that you cannot buy it unless what we see at first speaker, in which they say that on their side of the house that they are willing to depoliticize this and not have control over this media in the first place because they are willing to be perceived as significantly less in order to be just protected in general. This means then that when you have the depoliticization, you just don't have the capacity to do that. But also because secondly, this ultimately means that you all are dehumanized as a whole. You get seen less as a person in their eyes, and you seen more as less as a person in their eyes, and you get seen more as just something that has existed in status quo. Your rights aren't worth fighting for. The legislation around worth fighting for, and simultaneously the way that people interact about you is not worth fighting more. This occurs especially in the high conservative context of the Philippines, because when you have these people that only tolerate you just for being you but do not tolerate the way that the queer community operates in status quo, the only way to shift it is largely the Overton window, in which you have political messaging, in which you fight for things, in which you explain that your life, the very existence of who you are, is immediately needs to be protected. Because notice how this already happens, and this is already mentioned in Deputy, that things like such as the very mention of queer identity is already rated, such as things like 16 plus, or rated as not appropriate for studios. Notice how then immediately that further distances the humanity of queer people away from people on the ground. You are ultimately invisible to them because right from the start you're already a 16 plus category. You are not someone important to them. So regardless of who you are, you just lose that lobbying power amongst the individual self, but the political self too. You cannot fight for the same rights that you have because people don't understand why you need them, and that means that the individual upon you, only see you as a caricature of who you are. On the individual self, this means you are compromised and do not get to live with the visibility that you initially would normally have. But it also means that logistically and legally, you no longer are a person. And in the eyes of the state, you are no one and nothing because you are something that is only in the background of a movie. All of these reasons and us, more us.
Thank you for that speech. Let's have opposition reply. Here.
Okay, hi, just hold on. Go. No, go out. Sorry. My little sister is. Okay, sorry. Um, okay. Um, Before I begin, oh yeah, I forgot to mention Tiara. Shout out to Tiara, who's the president of the HEDT. Tiara's like our mom and has been working really hard for the HEDT. So shout out to her. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to do in this reply is explain the four clashes that I was able to identify in this debate. First on visibility, secondly on misinterpretation, thirdly on legislation, and fourthly on how the motion is worded. I think I want to clarify really quickly that this motion isn't about, for example, it isn't like from GovWhip. They explained to us that hardships of the of queer people is going to be like portrayed within their mainstream media, and this is why they still get the benefits that we are able to get. I think I quickly want to explain then that the hardships that the queer people go through is already mentioned in the info slide. Go through things like systemic inequality, discrimination, and legal inequities, which are things that they go through. These are the political struggles that they go through. So this is why I don't understand GovWhip's claim here, right? So I think this just really clarifies really quickly that this debate, or at least on their side of the house, they aren't able to pull up the benefit we have of this, right? Gov also has the problem of conflating acceptance and tolerance, and this is what their whole case relies on. They never reply to DLO when we explain that simplifying the politics means simplifying the complexity of people's identities, and the fact that they contradict their own case, their own frame when PM explains that depoliticization means to de-radicalize the movement and the stances and the goals that that it represents towards the media. I think this is when they already lose. First clash then on misrepresentation, right? I think then that I want to prove that what we as Gov says is that when in our side of the house, when you don't have political media, or at least when you stick to mainstream media, you allow queer people to be reduced to characters that is seen as loud. That means then that people are going to be more ignorant on Gov side of the house. They'll enjoy laughable portrayals of these people, and that'll create their understanding of queer people, but they're less incentivized to fight for change and support. I want to clarify that what's most important here is the visibility. On our side of the house, when DPM says that media is a trade-off for more power in either front of the movement, I think what's extremely important is that they lose the visibility of media, or they lose the visibility that media has to offer, which is the easiest way to reach the Filipino people. What then happens is that the discussions on government side of the house are where people remain ignorant, or even when Filipino people are open to having discussions about this, they tend to remain ignorant, and they tend to stick to how they interpret queer people because of the mainstream media, and they don't understand where they're coming from, their hardships and their struggles, and they decide to remain ignorant even when the conversation is right in their face, right? I think then that when opposition says stuff like, oh, you are less likely going to be seen as like, when government says that you are going to be seen as radically exaggerated, I think that even if it's true that you're going to get some sort of representation through mainstream media, I think that the way that you are portrayed, or at least the way that people understand you, is wrong. Because you won't accept that. You want to be understood. You don't want yourself to be put into shoe boxes by in which society interprets you to look like. And this is what mainstream media does. The fact that you choose to remain stagnant on government side of the house so you get less discrimination is inherently bad in itself. Because the discrimination that queer people will face is inherently symmetric. You will always get resistance. You will always get resistance for being loud and for going out on protest. You will always be discriminated against either way. So the reason why it's so important for you to fight, or it's so important for you to go out there and explain why, to go out there and explain through media the hardships that you go through, is so people understand you more. And even if both sides get the discrimination, both sides still get the resistance, both sides still get hurt, or at least face more hardships, at least they are able to go through this together. And at least the Filipino people are given more incentives to understand the people that they live with in everyday life, the people who they coexist with, and ensure better understanding within society. Proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have government reply. Here.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Stevie, could you check Messenger really quickly? Thank you.
Okay. Teka lang, let me see. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Sige, give me 10, siguro 20 seconds kay hinay ko mag-write. I'm so sorry when I reply, I write word per word. Okay, delete. 2 sentences ra to. Pero nag-fix na ko sa akong listahan. Don't mind like the paper noise because the electric fan is directly to me. Because I'm the hot. Let's go! Okay, last speech. Finally! Love is treasure! Diyos ko, I'm so pabis here. Sige. Dapat wala na ako gi-shoutout si Lian. I forgot to shout out someone. Shout out to Mindanao debate community at large. It's specifically to Ate, wait lang, I forgot her name. Let me review. To Ate Nicole Espanyol, because for every tournament that she requests to be shouted out, or shout outed, something like that. I always forget, so I'm sorry. But yes, hopefully you get shout. This is sufficient to redeem me. And yes, shout out to everyone. Okay. Ayun. Hindi na ako si Deputy Prime Minister. I am now Gov replying. Boosh. Okay. I won't open cam anymore too because I'm too sweaty. 3, 2, 1. Go. You cannot expect to backload everything on opposition whip and assume that your discussion will still win the grants. I'll directly charitably weigh. Ops case got lost in Japan the moment that it's directly unnuanced to the queer circumstance in the Philippines. The fact that media and politics has always been separate in Philippine context, such as the acceptance of vice ganda but also being a DDS, proves that there's a huge gap in their middle analysis, that all their efforts suddenly amalgamates to proper engagements politically. With zero evolution, they flag the very same reason, that if people don't know what you went through, they're not gonna vote for policies to help you, and that you need to touch their hearts. One, on technicalities, they reply that mainstream media is likely going to roll the correct form of representation. I mean, they rely on the assumption that mainstream media is likely going to roll the correct form of representation. On charitability, SideGov engages that regardless of how people treat this, the massive democratization of messaging on Ops best case congests and prevents the queer to both actively engage and regulate this. But structurally, my POI against LO still stands. We ought to question whether or not mainstream media is the only way to promote political incentives in the prospective case. Op never properly engages to this. That's why they never properly interpret the counterfactual on Gov. DLO, it's not about promoting queer politics in select mainstream media. Rather, we remove it from mainstream media and we replace it with different form of contents and then make the political discussions on other outlets such as news outlets or like probably even inherently direct testimonies, documentaries, etc. about queer groups that already exist in the current status quo. But two, there isn't any engagement from Op about the cost analysis of how it's more resource intensive to sustain the mainstream media media with controversial topics. This literally limits their capacity to pervade more spaces, e.g. political spaces, because now you need to appeal to the court of public opinion as well, but also because this places them in an unnecessarily heightened burden to sustain their controversial optics when they can leave it to begin with and share their political struggles on the most proximate people. That's why the success, even if it's low on margin on-site government, is much more sustainable because you allow people to hear these sensitive topics only on people who are already ready via proximity. This also means that if opposition makes that thinks that discrimination is not an intractable condition in the Philippines, then the margin worsens on their end when you allow bad actors to penetrate these spaces without the necessary capacity to regulate it. That's why when ops suddenly talk about respectability politics, this is all assuming that when we retract discussion in mainstream media, we retract discussion overall. The policy was already clear from the Prime Minister about reinvestment, but OPWIP's call out is much worse because they think that people's sources of information are just mainstream media. Invisibility is highly assumptive because they never attack whether or not we'd have less reach on our alternatives that we explicitly mentioned. The concession from DPM is to say that even if there's less attention about queer politics in mainstream media, or even if none at all, this allows better operation because you streamline political discussions on proper spaces. This means that trading off more space in queer media is justified because you get more power externally via gravitating more internal support that they still never engage on up until reply. But also, it's much more irrational for me to believe that mainstream media noticeability is still the tipping point in the current status quo. This is a perspective motion. Op should prove why pivoting away literally loses your fan base automatically when they're literally much more palatable on-site government, but also because they never prove why the retrospective support suddenly dies out. So literally, even if you use our queer channels mainly on-site government, I don't understand the opt-in highly lessening, but also because even if you believe opposition's discussion that you remove people, what Gov explicitly says is that the likely people who would opt out are likely malevolent actors who only prevent the active engagements of queer individuals. That's why I have to massively question their visibility because they never prove how they sustainably enter these spaces and whether or not that form of visibility is actually healthy towards queer individuals, and as to why that form of proliferation also maintains the very same positive messaging that they assume. The clearest margin that government proves is that even if charitably we lose people, we maintain the maximum amount of proximate individuals to which we've proven are the actors who are utile and willing to help the queer movement. Also because they never engage principally whether mainstream media is not pervasive towards the interests of queer individuals. As early as PM, we've already discussed how the de-radicalization case should still stand and should prevent the mainstream media from reinterpreting our own interests. All of those reasons, thanks for the championship.
All right, thank you for that speech. That ends the round. Debaters, you may now cross the House. For the judges, please go to the deliberations room. Thank you, guys.
Cross, thanks.